There's a line between true folklore and simply making things up. The great William Butler Yeats likely crossed it. His subject was the Leanan-sidhe, usually translated from the Gaelic to mean fairy mistress or fairy lover. More specifically, we're talking about the controversy surrounding her very existence as genuine folklore. For that, we'll blame William Butler Yeats, 19th and early 20th century writer, poet, and Irish folklorist, who likely did the lady a disservice. Indeed, also thanks to Yeats, many will say she never existed at all, even as Celtic folklore, and that Yeats simply made her up. We'll deal with that rumor right now. The myth of the fairy mistress predates Yeats' mention by at least 700 years, and the tradition is almost certainly even older. Its earliest recorded mention was in the Breton lay Lanville, written by Marie de France, a poet in the court of the English King Henry II, and composed in Anglo-Norman, sometime between the middle and late 12th century. In that version, the fairy mistress was a literal fairy princess, daughter of the king of fairies, a lady of great power and beauty who becomes the lover of a knight of King Arthur's court. I'm not going to tell that story here, but a quick search engine query should find it if you're curious. Aside, versions of the fairy lover existed in Celtic traditions across the British Isles. Needless to say, there's quite a bit of variation in how she was viewed, depending on the local culture. In Manx Gaelic, she was known as Leanan-sidhe and tended to haunt wells and springs, unlike her Irish cousins. Also, she would attach herself to one man, to whom she would be irresistibly beautiful, but remain invisible to anyone else. If the man succumbed to her charms, she would slowly drain his life away in vampiric fashion. The Leanan-sidhe, as she is currently known, comes down to us mostly through Yeats and Lady Jane Wilde, Irish activist and poet, who wrote under the pen name Speranza. Lady Wilde's view of the Leanan-sidhe was that, as the banshee was the spirit of death, the Leanan-sidhe was the spirit of life. Her lovers were often native Irish artists and writers, and she inspired them to their greatest works. By contrast, as Yeats writes in his appendix to Irish Fairy Tales, 1892, his own romantic notion was that she was indeed a muse of artists and writers, but that her inspiration forced them to work at white-hot fever pitch so that they inevitably burned out and died young. This, so far as anyone has been able to determine, is a Yeats embellishment, and likely not part of Irish folklore proper until then. Yet if you look up the Leanan-sidhe in most contemporary sources, you will likely find the Yeats version first. This was a clear case, not of a created myth, but of an existing myth evolving into the modern era, with a little nudge. To be fair to Yeats, it wasn't a large embellishment. Aside from her duties as a muse, the Irish Leanan-sidhe was often also supposed to be a sort of vampiric spirit like her Manx cousins. However, they were never invisible, though in some versions she appears to have a blank or missing face, a trait shared by some Japanese yokai. Only her chosen victim would be able to see it. Also, she would drain his life only if he succumbed to her beauty. If he refused, she would instead become his servant. Notwithstanding this, the vampiric theme was far from universal. In earlier tales such as Lanville, the main risk her lover faced was breaking faith with her, mostly by violating a condition she'd had set upon their union, whereupon she would leave, and her lover either lost her forever or had to undergo some serious struggles to get her back. All in all, and despite her charms, the Leanan-sidhe was probably best avoided, no matter how good a muse she could be. Only the fairy lover herself would know which variety she was. One might find one who had been taking her cue from Yeats instead of Lady Wilde,